I'm glad to be here. I want to thank everyone behind the scenes and front of the scenes. So today I'm going to try to give you a brief overview of my research. And it's going to be roughly a holistic overview. And I'll also try to touch on some teaching aspects as well. So my main focus is going to be on thinking about computation and how computation can help us understand the world we live in. All right, so first we're going to start out looking at, well, what exactly is computational science? All right, so in a nutshell, one way to think about computational science is that it's simply the use of mathematics and computers to help us study and solve scientific and engineering problems. And so this is one way we can think about computational science. And here is a flow chart for computational science and how it might work. So the idea is that you might start with some sort of real-world problem that we're interested in. We're collecting data on it. For instance, maybe we want to predict, is it going to snow tomorrow? Right? You're collecting data, maybe data, historical data, so on and so forth. Maybe you're performing some physical experiments, so on and so forth. You can develop some sort of mathematical model, some sort of tool that will predict or represent the sort of real-world phenomena you're interested in. And maybe you can tailor these models, you can tweak them a bit, you can change them to suit whatever needs you have. Often these models are quite complicated and clunky to work with. So we then devise some sort of discretization, some sort of simplification of that model so that we can get tangible results. Once we have this discretization, we typically translate this to some sort of computer language, some sort of computer code, so we can have the computer do most of the heavy lifting for us. It's quite good at performing computations, so arithmetic operations. Once we have our computer simulation running on a computer, we might get some sort of output that we would like to assess, understand, observe, and we have this sort of feedback loop where we might change parameters based on what we observe, and this can help us inform on how maybe we should tweak our model, how we should change our experiments, and so on and so forth. So it's this sort of symbiotic type of relationship that goes on with computational science. So this is just a sort of a rough overview for computational science. And there are many applications, right? Many very interesting applications. Too many to name, but my research has spanned a couple of different areas. So I've looked quite a bit at these so-called porous media flows. Those are flows that are in subterranean, typically subterranean, deep within the earth type of phenomena where you have multiple fluids moving around. You're trying to understand how do these fluids behave in that type of environment. So magma dynamics would be one example. Pore scale flows, another example. I also have applications where we've looked at collagen fibers, so looking at muscle fibers from a horse or some sort of animal, a human, and we're trying to understand how exactly do those collagen fibers line up, and maybe we can predict if there's going to be some sort of tear or if you're going to have some sort of injury if you strain your muscles too much. But so the point is that there's many applications that you can think of and apply computational science to. And one of the strengths of computational science is that it can be applied to problems for which we might have very limited real-world data. And so I'll speak a bit about these more interesting applications a bit later, but I just wanted to give you an overview and just to point out that computational science is not limited to like one area. It's quite broad. Something I'd like to bring up is that there are a couple of challenges I've noticed when I've been working in this area. And since I'm sort of a mathematician by training, this is just something that I've noticed is that for the past 40 years or so, the design of numerical methods, mathematical methods for computational science has essentially evolved into almost a formal, abstract mathematical endeavor. And studying mathematics for the sake of mathematics is fine. However, if we want to use some of these more modern mathematical tools, there sort of needs to be a middleman. We have to have a way to sort of translate these complicated abstract ideas into something that might be tangible, that might be useful. And unfortunately, there's this trend where we have mathematicians who are writing research for mathematicians, so sort of for mathematicians and by mathematicians. So if a computational scientist comes along and they read this abstract work, they'll have a hard time trying to adopt it and seeing if there's any sort of use in it at all. So this can create all sorts of challenges if we have these new promising, advanced, modern tools, but we have this sort of widening gap that's occurring between the fundamental mathematics, the underlying domain scientists, the domain science that we're trying to work with, and even computational and computer software. All right, so one of my goals is to try to address that challenge. Another challenge that I've noticed is that there are some sort of long-standing, widely held beliefs that are quite difficult to shake. So oftentimes the reasonings for folks in computational science sticking to certain numerical methods, or they're quite insistent that there's only one way to do things, it's not always the best reasoning. Those will always lead to good science, I think. So I'll touch on this point later as well. I'll also give some examples of where this paradigm, I think, can get shaken up a bit, and we can get some interesting and useful results by sort of dismantling that sort of strict and rigid perspective. All right, so that being said, my research spans a spectrum. So on one end of the spectrum, I have some more fundamental mathematics and science where, again, I'm developing these mathematical tools. Then once we have some suitable mathematical tools, I might be interested in some sort of real-world application. We can try to translate those mathematical tools to some sort of computer language. We can produce some interesting results, again, and we can hopefully use that to infer something about the real world. Along the way, you might realize that a lot of the tools are quite expensive computationally, and so we may have to turn to parallel computing to help us speed up the results, so our time to solution. Or maybe if we're interested in, say, running larger problems or trying to synthesize larger amounts of data, we have to turn to parallel computations to help us achieve that goal. So my research sort of spans this wide spectrum. So in some sense, my research is application-driven, even though formally, behind the scenes, maybe I'm a mathematician. So here's a word wall, and I'll put this up at the end, so you don't have to memorize everything. But, right, so I have some buzzwords here. So if you're interested in any of these sort of buzzwords, I'd be happy to speak about them afterwards offline. All right, so my research, again, spans quite a few areas. But at the end of the day, the unifying theme is computational science. And how do we make computations efficient, effective, and how can we infer useful information from our computations? All right, so on the mathematical side of things, just a really brief overview. I often try to study or represent or approximate complicated functions or data and try to represent them using simpler ideas, right? Approximations, estimates. And one of the big things is that there's often a goal in mind. There's often some sort of theoretical background, some sort of theoretical guarantee that we have floating around that ensures that the tools we use, the mathematical tools we use, are going to be useful, and they're going to do what we think they do. Right? They're going to perform a certain way. They're going to behave a certain way. At the same time, when we look at these mathematical tools that are being developed, there's also some foresight that needs to be had to look to the future a bit when we inspect the trend of computational hardware and how it's being developed. So many times we might have to rethink how we implement certain numerical methods, computational methods, so that they fit well on these advanced computational architectures. And I'll give an example of this in a bit. But the idea here is that in many cases, we might have some sort of traditional method that's been around for a while, but maybe it doesn't fit quite well on these emerging architectures. And so we have to find ways to maybe express these methods so that they expose sufficient parallelism, or maybe we have to think about new tools that will sort of be future-proof in some sense. They'll apply well to these modern architectures. So one of my focuses recently has been on accelerated computing. So this is often done using graphics processing units, GPUs, field programmable gate arrays, so on and so forth. And the idea is that these are highly specialized computing devices that have many, many cores packed into them. So there's a large amount of parallelism. So it's a high throughput but low memory type of device. So you have to be very careful with the precious memory that's on the device, and you have to sort of adopt your algorithms so that they work well for these sorts of devices. And again, one of the things that I've been thinking about quite deeply is ensuring that the methods that we pick and select are going to map well to these sort of architectures. So one of the reasons why I've been thinking about this and focusing on this is if you look at the trend, so these are various vendors, so AMD, Intel, NVIDIA, so on and so forth. They've been designing certain computational hardware, and if we look at the horizontal axis, as time increases, we see that the number of cores, say on the vertical axis here, is increasing. So they're packing more and more cores into these chipsets. And this trend doesn't really seem to be going anywhere. And it's largely probably going to be driven even further by the AI craze, right, machine learning craze, and of course, any sort of graphics applications. So this trend doesn't really look like it's going anywhere. And there's quite a great deal of benefit that we can get out of exploiting these sort of devices to accelerate our computational work. So this is how I sort of see myself. Again, I sort of see myself as a middleman. So I try to translate between these different worlds. So trying to understand and maybe ensure and prove certain things about the mathematical algorithms we're working on, but also try to show some of these more modern tools and techniques to domain practitioners and try to explain to them, hey, these tools are useful. They do have a lot of promise, and they can and will most likely beat some of these traditional methods in certain aspects. All right, so this is how I sort of see myself as a facilitator between these domains. All right, so next I'll try to give some motivating example here where computational science really shines. So here is one of the applications that I like to think about. This is a porous media type of application. So we have some reservoir here, some sort of domain. So you see we have some sort of factory. Maybe we have a house or a farm nearby. This factory is producing something, maybe chemicals, maybe it's a t-shirt factory. They're dyeing certain shirts or something like this. Oftentimes, there's going to be some sort of spill, chemical spill, some sort of leak. And this substance is going to leak into the ground. It's going to infiltrate some water tables, potentially. And this contaminant will be transported along this reservoir, this aquifer. However, the real-world picture is quite difficult to visualize here. So this is why there's sort of a cartoon doodle, because we don't have access to the real-world picture. So this is in contrast to if you're trying to maybe build a more efficient car or build a more efficient airplane. You can look at an airfoil wing and you can put it in a wind tunnel. You can physically manipulate it. But for these sorts of problems, we don't really have access to a real-world picture. And computational science can shine because it turns out that there are first principles, so ideas from physics that allow us to maybe predict or understand how this contaminant might move. And so how much of contaminant will be in a certain region at a certain time, how fast is the contaminant moving, and so on and so forth.
You mean that would help generate a picture just like this?
Help generate a picture just like this one, yes. And also, we're going to be more than a picture. We're going to have some sort of quantifiable evidence to say, hey, right, it's going to be accurate in some sense. Right? And also helps for remediation, or helps for us understanding, is there going to be a catastrophe? Right? Maybe the picture isn't going to be this bad, depending on the rate at which the contaminant was leaking, right? And so on and so forth. But that's the idea, is that we can produce a simulation that will basically recreate this sort of picture. That's a good point. So for this particular example I've given, it turns out that classical physical experimentation is severely limited. Right? We don't have access to large-scale space-time data. So for instance, for these types of applications, the fluid might move something like 100 centimeters a day. So it's a very, very slow process. And if you just wait 3 years, maybe that's not the best idea. Right? Because you'll get the results. You'll see if the contaminant has reached the water or reached this river, for instance. But we'd like to be able to maybe predict and see what happens before that catastrophic event might occur. A lot of the material parameters involved for this type of model are typically nonlinear and empirical. So there's lots of nonlinearities that are floating around. Again, the space and time scales are very, very large, and that can be a challenge to deal with. And also, much of this phenomena has like a multi-scale type of nature. So you can think about the quantum scale, think about the molecular scale. And as you move along the scale, the processes involved might be a little bit different. So as you move to, say, this Darcy scale, the field scale, we have kilometers or meters, the models involved might be a little bit different than if we move down and we look at, say, the pore scale, say in the centimeters or nanometer range. All right, so for these sorts of problems where we don't have access to a real-world picture, computational science is really a necessary tool if we want to be able to infer useful information. Right, so without it, we're sort of out of luck, so to speak. Right? We don't have access to the real-world picture. That domain is very large. It's thousands of kilometers in length, maybe 800 feet in depth or something like that. And we can't really dig into the Earth and get that sort of cross-section. All right, and as I said before, we have limited space-time data. Right? These processes take up a lot of space, and they are often very slow. It might take quite a long time for us to actually extract the results. The underlying physics and engineering can be kind of clunky and complicated to deal with. And also, again, we don't really have access to this sort of standard picture. Can't really manipulate the model. We can't play it at scale. So oftentimes in many engineering contexts, you can maybe build a smaller scale drone or plane or car or something like that, and you can manipulate it, you can play with it. However, for these sorts of pore scale flows, we don't quite have access to that, or these sorts of flows in porous media, we don't quite have access to that, that type of phenomenon. All right, so just to recap, right, I have these two challenges that I brought up. One challenge I brought up was this idea that some of the tools involved for computational science have sort of developed on their own, independently, separately, as a purely formal mathematical enterprise. And also, we have these sort of stingent or staunch sort of supporters of, I don't know, how things were done in the past. And they are a bit reluctant to adopt any sort of new or modern techniques. So here I'll just give you some hypothetical questions that have come up in my research. So I've gone to various collaborators and I've sort of posed some questions to them. And I'll just go through some of the answers that I've received. And they're not always maybe there's some truth to them, there's some validity to them, but oftentimes they're not exactly incredibly sound. So here's one question I often try to ask. So why are you using these sort of outdated, obsolete mathematical tools? This is one question I pose to them. And it's not, I usually don't tell them that in such a harsh manner, but that's sort of the idea. So here's one type of response I usually get quite a bit, is that these new methods are a bit too complicated to understand. Right? So from one perspective, that sort of makes sense, I suppose. Right? If the methods are too complicated to understand, then maybe it's not worthwhile pursuing them. But on the other hand, it could just be a lack of familiarity. It could be a lack of the method not being expressed in a great way, that sort of thing. So I think there's maybe some things that are behind the scenes that we could do as mathematicians to make these techniques a bit more approachable to a wider audience. And so here's another response I typically get, is that these new methods are too slow and too expensive computationally. Right? And so again, maybe there is some truth to that. However, with the advent of modern parallel computing and some care and dedication, turns out that in many cases, we can sort of mitigate some of the costs involved here and some of the expenses involved in these processes. Another response I get quite a bit is also mathematicians don't care about whether or not their tools are going to be applicable or not, which is fine. However, that's, again, maybe not the best reason. Maybe it's not the best reason for not adopting these advanced tools, these new and modern tools. Another response I typically get is that, this is how we did things in the past, and so this is how we do things in the future. And it's sort of nice because you're familiar with these pre-existing techniques and tools. However, again, maybe it's not the best reasoning, right? You're sort of stuck in your ways type of mentality. All right, and another response I get quite a bit often is some of the worst case theoretical results for many of these new tools often suggest that they won't work well. However, in many cases, and for real world applications, we don't typically have this worst case behavior. And so in many cases, it's actually much better than the worst case behavior. So in a purely abstract sense, in many cases, you can have sort of disastrous effects and phenomena that just isn't quite physical. So the point I'm trying to make here is that a lot of the responses I get for not adopting these more modern tools and techniques are not exactly convincing. They're not exactly conclusive. All right, so what I'll do next is I'll show some examples that challenge some of these widely held beliefs. All right, so for many of these modern techniques, it turns out that there's a sort of price to pay. They're a bit more sophisticated, there's a bit more going on, and more often than not, they are going to require more computational power. More work is involved with these modern techniques. And generally, that means that you have a situation where you expect that maybe overall your simulation will be slower. So if you think about if someone told you to add a bunch of numbers together, the more numbers you have to add together, that might take you longer. Right? So if you have more and more computations to do, that might take you longer than a situation where you had, say, fewer computations to do. However, in many cases, what I found is that some of these modern techniques that are more expensive computationally technically can be faster if you add in more appropriate metrics. So if you look at time to solution, but add some sort of specified accuracy, you can show that some of these modern tools, they give you more bang for your buck. So the computations you do, even though they're more expensive, they can get you much further than some of these pre-existing older techniques. And right, sort of in the same tune, right? Per variable, per unknown, often these more modern techniques can be more accurate per unknown. Also, many of these tools, these modern techniques, since they're more expensive, it turns out computationally, turns out that they map better to these parallel architectures that are sort of expecting that there's a lot of work to be done. There's lots of computations to be done to keep these massively parallel devices happy. All right, and so I've done quite a bit of work trying to think about these higher order methods and how do they fit in the grand scheme of things in terms of classical methods, modern methods, so on and so forth, and trying to apply appropriate metrics for trying to understand how well do these methods actually behave in practice. All right, so in many cases, we sort of have these competing goals where we want fewer computations. However, fewer computations might lead to a certain low accuracy result. So maybe you want more computations. And so this is often a delicate balancing act where the best algorithm. Question.
What are DOE and DOF?
Yeah, good question. So DOE is degrees of efficacy, and DOF is degrees of freedom. So these are our variables, our unknowns. And what's going on here is that we're basically trying to have a weighted analysis of how our method is performing. So I take some sort of computational tool, it's running on a parallel computer architecture, and I'm looking at how fast does the algorithm run, I'm looking at the result of the algorithm, how accurate is it, and I'm putting all of those in sort of a weighted metric. So time to solution is often the metric that's used traditionally. You just want to get your result fast, but that doesn't mean that your result is accurate. Right, so we have these other metrics that we put in, such as degrees of efficacy, which tells us roughly how efficient is a given unknown, right, from these, say, low order or high order methods. And there's a delicate balancing act. So there's often not always a clear-cut scenario where one method's always going to be the best over time. All right, so here's another example. And this slide is sort of slowly changing. So what's going on is I'm injecting a fluid into one part of the domain. And I'm, again, sort of this creeping, crawling flow scenario. And what you're seeing is just a snapshot of the simulation at a given time, say like 700 days. And each one of these stills is a different numerical method, a different simulation type of result. And if we look at this very first result, it looks totally different than some of these other methods. And so some of these other methods are giving us a much more crisp, much more well-defined solution, whereas that earlier one is much more of like a blob. So we're getting almost an entirely different type of approximation or different type of solution compared to some of these more modern tools. So what's happening here is that, again, some of these higher order methods do have some benefit. So even if I keep the mesh fixed, but I'm increasing, say, the work I do per grid, per cell, I'm getting some very impressive results as we tweak our algorithm a bit. In the same scenario here, again, I'm injecting a fluid, say from the left part of the domain. It's going to move from left to right. And we're seeing a bunch of stills. And you can see that this initial still looks quite a bit different than some of the results from these other simulations. And some of these other simulations have a much more sharp result at the end of the day. And the lower order technique, the sort of traditional technique on the same mesh, on the same grid, is giving us results that are almost totally different. And this can give us a bit of a challenge if we want to understand, right, and synthesize information coming from that result. Right? How accurate is it? How much fluid is at a certain location at a certain time? We're going to be getting different results, and that's undesirable. All right, so another thing with computational is more modern computational methods is that I'm looking at their performance as well. In many cases, I've actually shown that these techniques can map well to computational architecture, some parallel computational architecture. And what I'm showing up here is some bandwidth. So on the vertical axis, we're seeing how well can a given numerical method utilize a computational, parallel computational devices architecture. How well can it use the resources on that architecture? And what we find is that for the higher order techniques, these new modern techniques, they are typically able to utilize much more of the device. So the device's resources are being used quite well, whereas for the lower order techniques, we're not able to utilize as much of the device. So this is important because in many cases, the device is going to be happier if we have this sort of saturation. It has more work to do. It's going to generally give us better bang for our buck. And same thing down here, if we do some napkin math, AI here means arithmetic intensity. So that's just talking about if I load a variable, how many computations am I doing with that variable? That's sort of that idea here. And larger is typically better for these parallel devices. They have an abundance of cores. And these cores are sort of expecting, and they want to do work. They want to do computations. And so the more computations we have, the happier the device will be. And typically, you can get your results in a much more efficient manner. And so for these lower order techniques, or these more classical methods, the arithmetic intensity and the amount of computations we're doing overall, roughly, is going to be much slower than some of these more modern techniques. And so if we look carefully at these techniques sort of in a vacuum for certain toy model problems, we find that some of these modern techniques are quite promising, and they map well to these emerging architectures. And again, the thing I'd like to keep in mind is that this sort of trend is not going anywhere, right? So these computational architectures are seeking to pack more and more cores in and try to really expose this sort of parallelism. So we can have numerical methods that are fitting well to this sort of architectures will be in a good spot for the future, for future computational science. So here's another example I'll give. So again, this is a situation where I'm injecting a fluid into one portion of the domain. I'm trying to extract it at another point. So the injection point's down here, the extraction point's up here. And we're taking various snapshots. So this is the fluid after a certain amount of time. This is the snapshot of the fluid after a bit further in the future. And this is another snapshot say 200 days. And the first row is this sort of modern technique. And the second row, this bottom row, is the classical technique. And we get roughly good agreement. However, again, if we sort of look carefully at the underlying resolution, we can see that we're getting a much higher quality solution coming from the first row, right? The second row is a bit blurry, it's a bit muddy, and so the issue is that if we're trying to understand when will that plume reach the top right corner here, we may get a different result if we look carefully at these two different techniques. So it's, again, to the untrained eye, it might not seem like there's much going on, but there is a bit more features that are being revealed in this top row than there is in this bottom row here. And again, this is, sort of challenging this preconceived notion that these higher order methods can't really do much for us. Right, so it turns out, these modern techniques can't do much for us. Right? But here we're finding that actually the opposite is true.
Here you're talking about fluid.
Fluid, yes. So some sort of fluid being injected into a domain. So you can think of it as, say, some sort of contaminant. You can think of it as, say, water. You can think of it as, any sort of fluid.
Does the technique apply in kind, or as well, let's say, to something like making an image or resolution of an image if you were shooting a photograph?
That I'm not sure. Typically, these techniques are used for partial differential equations. So these are complicated equations, and the techniques are used to discretize those sorts of equations. In terms of just, say, modifying, say, like someone gave you a still image, I'm not aware. I don't think it's the most natural application of the techniques that are here. So the idea is that these sort of techniques are able to generate these images, as opposed to, say, like taking a snapshot from a camera or something like that. That's a good question. I'm not sure if there's a direct analog for the techniques I'm using for that. But there do exist other methods that may be more appropriate for the scenario that you're describing.
I was just wondering if there are techniques for, let's say, certain kinds of photography that will enhance an image or make it more detailed or allow you to extract higher resolution from it. I was wondering if the two techniques are similar in any way.
There are some related techniques and tools that are used there, but it's not exactly the main goal. But there is quite a bit of overlap between some of the tools that you're talking about and the tools that I'm using. Yep. There's not exactly a one-to-one relationship there. All right, so I kind of had this spiel about research, but I'd also like to take some time to talk about teaching and outreach, and also some parallels that I see between my research in computational science and some of the work that I've done with teaching and outreach. So over the years, I've been quite fortunate to be a part of many outreach programs. Many of them are for trying to improve diversity in the mathematical sciences. And again, I've sort of seen an interesting parallel that I was able to draw between computational science research and how maybe we should go about thinking about teaching students, so pedagogy. All right, so again, I've been involved with many programs in the past. I don't want to read them all out, but I've had a good deal of experience working with these outreach programs, and also just my individual teaching that I'm required to do. And so from there, I've been able to sort of synthesize and draw some interesting parallels between computational science and teaching. And here I've just sort of done a mapping of this. So on the right over here, we have maybe the computational science flow chart. And on the left, I've sort of drawn a parallel for pedagogy and maybe how to think about teaching. So usually in computational science, we start with some sort of model. And when I think about teaching now, I typically try to also give students sort of a mental model, maybe an idea to a way for them to compartmentalize or understand what exactly they're doing. Maybe a way for them to relate it to something that they've previously explored or looked at. The next rung down is we don't here. Typically, these mental models are more complicated, so we come up with some sort of discretization to make this more complicated problem easier. We break it up into smaller, more digestible steps. And I can sort of do the same thing when I'm teaching. maybe you have some overarching theme, some sort of overarching goal, but then you can break that goal up into smaller pieces to sort of reach it, sort of like a breadcrumb, breadcrumb trail, something like that. So you have this larger scaffolding, but then you have smaller steps that can be done on your way to this, understanding this larger, more complicated topic. All right, so once we have our discretization, we typically take it and we try to put it on a computer. So we run some simulations. We look at the results of our simulations. Maybe we sort of draw some sort of conclusions, look at some results. Maybe we refine the model based on the underlying output, and we sort of iterate. We sort of repeat and refine. In the classroom, I do something similar. I've noticed we try activities. Maybe I observe how the students react to these activities. I adjust my lesson plans according to them, right? And I observe the students, right? And so on and so forth. So we have that sort of interesting direct parallel there. The next rung for computational science is often some debugging. Maybe there's some sort of error analysis that you do once you look at your simulations. And with students, I have a similar motto or similar approach where I try to get the students to understand where they're making their errors, how exactly these errors are coming up. Is there a way that they can ensure that these errors won't be made again? And to help them sort of understand mistakes will happen. However, it's not necessarily the end of the world. Right? But the idea is that there's this interesting parallel between these two ideas. And finally, I focus quite a bit on parallelism, trying to take these simulations and have them run on these massively parallel computers. And on the teaching side of things, I often have to teach classes that are very large, maybe hundreds of students, right? 100 students, 400 students, that sort of thing. And trying to design lesson plans and curriculum that map well or scale to classes that size can be quite a challenge. But in any event, right, so I sort of have this direct parallel between these ideas. All right, so something else that I find interesting is that just like with some of these computational science applications, there's sort of a direct analogy for teaching and pedagogy. You can't really see inside of a student's head. Right? It would be nice, but oftentimes it's difficult to understand. What is their root confusion? What's the fundamental thing that gets them confused? What's the fundamental thing that gets them stuck? Why exactly did they make a particular mistake? Why would they respond or react to a question or a problem in a certain way? And how do we teach students this sort of meta idea? How can they learn on their own? How can they learn about learning? But anyway, the thing that I wanted to point out here is that, again, there's sort of this interesting parallel. There are many applications in computational science where we can't really see the physical picture that we're trying to model. With teaching, oftentimes I find myself in a similar situation where I can't really see inside a student's head. I can't really understand what they're thinking without some more prying. So I'll just share some things that I found that have been quite successful when I'm teaching. All right, so the first thing is that there's just no substitute for work. Right, so lots and lots of practice is often structured. And mathematics is not really a spectator sport, so they have to be active participants in their learning. Right, so that's the first thing that I've noticed. Something else that I've noticed is that interactive learning is really important, really critical. So having students interacting with one another, interacting with their peers. Often I find small groups work quite well. And typically what I like to do, if the class size will permit it, is that I have them work in small groups. They'll work on a problem together, typically standing up at a whiteboard or a chalkboard. So working on these problems independently in these small groups. Then afterwards, we might have a larger group discussion. We might try to communicate the results back to the whole classroom. So if you're familiar with distributed parallel computing, this is sort of the same idea where you send off your data into chunks, into pieces, in these individual cores, these individual processors. They work on them separately, and then we sort of communicate the results back. So a similar idea here. Something else I found that's quite useful for students is that I find that if they can explain what they're doing, they have relatively good mastery of the material. So if they can teach someone what they've just learned, that helps them sort of understand what they're doing, and it makes it more clear in their head, and they're able to express much more clearly what they want to do and how they're able to achieve and solve certain problems. Again, I've mentioned this before, but I found that students standing up and working at the whiteboard is important. Nowadays, I think there's a lot of distractions with tablets and phones and computers and things like this. And so if they have a marker in their hand, they have to point at the whiteboard, they have to erase, it sort of removes that issue of being glued to a phone all the time. Something else I find that's quite useful is students maintaining a journal of errors. So oftentimes you'll make mistakes, and I ask them to keep a little notebook, and I say, in this notebook, just write down what got you confused, what got you stuck, and what got you out of this rut, what made you sort of have this aha moment where you sort of understand or clarified or corrected your mistakes. And this can be useful because students can go back and they can take a look and say, okay, this is where I went wrong, or so on and so forth. So they can ensure that maybe this mistake won't be made again. Try to sneak in some sort of computer coding. Often the easiest thing is like a markup language. So if you've heard of LaTeX, right? I have some students learn something like HTML. I find that that's quite helpful for them just to think about learning sort of in a different way. And of course, disrupting kind of these hard set paradigms. So oftentimes with mathematics, there's a very rote way to teach. So often, the professor stands at the front of the room and lectures for an hour, and the students just sort of sit there and listen. But I find that sort of paradigm, even though it worked in the past, it might not work for future students. And typically, I find that it's a way too stringent of a thing to do. And the sort of more interactive learning is much more successful, at least in my experience. All right, so this is just sort of a rundown of what I found quite successful for my teaching. All right, so here I'll end off with some concluding remarks. I want to have some time for questions and maybe mingling. But right, in summary, computational science can solve and help us understand our world in a much deeper way. And what I find really interesting about it is for applications for which we don't have a lot of access to real-world space-time data. So it can help us understand, right, this sort of phenomena in a much deeper way. I try to act as a middleman. I try to bridge this gap between these new modern tools and computational science. And hopefully, I can sort of bridge this gap that I find is sort of almost, increasingly widening just because individuals are sort of in their own lane. So mathematicians are doing their own thing, but computational scientists are doing their own thing, and the experimentalists are doing their own thing, right? So on and so forth. Bridging that gap, I think, can help us solve some very interesting problems. Something else that I sort of discovered is that there's some interesting parallels between computational science research and also teaching. So sort of direct analogs that I can sort of draw between my research and also my teaching. So it's not these sort of disjoint or completely orthogonal ideas. So that being said, I'm excited to be part of the MIT community, and I look forward to any sort of collaboration in terms of research and teaching as well. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm glad to mingle, and I'll stick around. So that's it.
Great.